So welcome everybody. I'm Laura Aiken, the Director of Graduate Career Development, and we're so thrilled you're able to join us today for our salary negotiations workshop. Today, you're fortunate enough to have our friend of Bentley, Matt Shannon, join us, who is the Senior Managing Consultant at Beacon Hill Staffing, who has been here many times, and we're thrilled to have him join us virtually this year. And with his experience, I'm sure you'll gain a lot from this session together, including a mock salary negotiation that will take place with one of your fellow colleagues who is here today, Ada. Please enjoy this. Be sure to interact. So use the capabilities that are available to you in Zoom. Turn on your camera. We'd love to see your faces. You're also welcome to use your raise hand feature and use the chat. I will be checking that throughout. And as Matt has time during his presentation, and certainly at the end, we'll be sure to answer all of your questions. With that, I'd like to introduce Matt to take over the presentation. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Laura. Good morning, everybody. As she mentioned, I've been working with Bentley since, if you can believe it, I think it was 2014 or 15, actually. So it's been a long time, which has been great. I work for Beacon Hill Staffing, as she mentioned. If you haven't heard of us before, we're a national staffing firm. We're started here in the Boston area, hence Beacon Hill. And so I've been in staffing it'll be my 11th year this coming March. So I focus predominantly, early in my career, I started on temp to hire, and now I've moved into more direct hire staffing since 2014. I work in the finance accounting space. So we work with pretty much any company you can imagine here in the greater Boston area, every industry. And my focus is on folks in the finance accounting space. I have talked to colleagues though on IT and admin. So I'm very well versed in what's going on in the market. Things are changing rapidly, obviously with COVID. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm just going to go through some pros and cons, things to keep an eye out for during your negotiation when you get to the offer stage. And then with that, we'll leave some time at the end. We'll do some Q&A. We'll do the mock interviews or the mock salary negotiation to give you guys a chance to see what that looks like. But, I'd like to keep the end open to some questions because usually you guys have some really good questions, situations you've been in. And maybe I can give you my personal and professional experiences and advice to how to handle those situations moving forward. So with that, we'll get started with the presentation. So this is just kind of the contents of, we'll go through the new salary law in Massachusetts. Not so new anymore, but a lot of people still don't understand it or know that it's out there. Not every state nationally has this law, so it might depend on where your company of origin is. We'll talk about salary law do's and don'ts, determining your number, compensation, just set some expectations on raises and job changes, when to negotiate, reviewing an offer. We'll probably do the salary negotiation right around when to negotiate, and then we'll talk about competing offers, counter offers, some tips, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So, all right, so first, just something everyone should be aware of. It's something most HR people are aware of. Some don't necessarily know this yet if they're just getting into it, but Mass passed a law back in 2018 that essentially means employers may not ask about wage or salary history after an offer of employment with compensation has been made. The bill also stops employees from prohibiting employees from discussing their salaries among one another. I think that's kind of tough to obviously regulate, but they do have tools, HR does, to try to keep this information confidential. So ideally, they use these tools to try to keep people in the dark about salaries and depressed pay historically. So this law should cover all prospective employees applying or considered for employment in Massachusetts. It also covers all employers in Massachusetts, including public and private employers. And basically, they're just not allowed to ask about past salary, benefits, or any form of compensation, quote unquote, salary history. So now there's some pros and cons to this law, in my opinion. Again, this is just my opinion, but for someone like myself, who's a recruiter, who's helping a candidate through the process, sometimes it's really helpful to know what you're targeting. But again, that doesn't mean I need to know your prior history of salary, benefits, expenses like that. It's more or less to know a range, and we'll get into that when you know your number. Knowing your range and knowing what your salary compensation expectations should be will help you in these situations, because the conversation is still going to come up. You know, they're going to ask you about salary, but they're going to ask it in a different way. And we'll talk a little bit about that coming up. So now this is where the law doesn't cover, and this is where you'll get some of the questioning. So current employers being considered for promotion or transfer within the same employer doesn't really cover that. But at that point, you've already negotiated in a sense. You probably have familiarity with your HR team or the hiring manager that's having that conversation. So that's a little bit different. That's why this law isn't necessarily protecting that individual. Salary history that a job applicant discloses voluntarily or without prompting. That's something to be mindful of. If you feel comfortable sharing and you feel that's helpful, then you're welcome to share. You know, whether you decide to do that or not, I think as we go through the presentation, you may decide maybe you want to hold that information until the end, if you can, from a negotiation perspective. But again, we'll kind of get into that a little bit later in the presentation. Salary history obtained from sources other than the applicant or current or former employees. It's really difficult to call or talk to a reference and have them even know what your compensation is. I think that's really more what that law suggests. So what I would do is just make sure you're familiar with this law going into any job search process, so you're aware of what can and can't be asked. But like I said, some HR people, believe it or not, are just not familiar enough with this law, or they haven't maybe they haven't hired in a while. It's a small company. They just may not be aware this law is something they need to follow. So if you never feel comfortable answering the question, you can certainly say, I just don't really feel comfortable answering that question right now. So you can always answer it that way. But check out mass.gov for more information. All right. So here's what you may not do. And this is really for HR people, but really so you guys know. Ask employer candidate about salary history, required to disclose applicant, we covered that. Make a statement that reasonably can be construed as an invitation to disclose salary history. So even if you tell the applicant it's voluntary, you may get a question like, well, you know, in order for I to know what compensation you're looking for, what were you making in your last position? And it's a very open-ended question, but essentially they're asking about your salary history, of course. Again, ask current or former employees about the applicant's salary history, and then screen applicants based on salary history. So as you'll see later in negotiation, actually a question that came up during that prep conversation was, a lot of these applications have salary requirements in them in order to submit application. My best advice here, and we'll get to it, is let's put a range that you're targeting. And so you'll need to, there'll be some information you need to gather before then, but always give a range. Don't give necessarily a specific amount in those application questions, at least to start. So with that, what we can do, you can negotiate compensation and benefits for terms of the job with applicants. So the HR person will be allowed to negotiate with you, or the hiring manager will be able to negotiate in this instance. They can inform applicants of the salary range or anticipated salary for the subject. A lot of times they'll tell you the budget we're targeting is X number to Y number. Ask applicants for their minimum preferred or expected compensation in the new job. This is a question I typically ask all candidates. What is the minimum you would want to hear? What is the minimum compensation that would work for you that you'd want to hear about a position? And the reason I ask it that way is I don't want to share a job with a candidate that is maybe below their salary expectations or their current financial situation. A lot of times that question gives me just a base number to know what to apply to. That's not necessarily their range, but some of you may say, listen, if the job is 100% remote, maybe I'd take $5,000 or $10,000 less to stay remote. I don't have expenses for travel, commute. I'm not buying a lunch every day, maybe, maybe your time, valuing your time, that will save money perhaps. So really, some people may take a job less than what maybe they're making now if it improves in other areas of their life or their situation. So that's why minimum is always something to consider, knowing what your minimum number would be to take a new position. So you can also ask for expected compensation. To me, like, if you're going to be asked the expected compensation, you got to be ready to know what your market value and range is. So be ready for that question early on in the process. You'll see when we get to the first exercise in the salary negotiation, the first thing we do is what happens if you're asked in the initial consult what your salary expectations are. And so if that's what's asked of you initially, you better make sure you've done your homework and know the number. And we're going to get to that in a second, so that you can give an appropriate answer that doesn't negate you from the position. Ask applicants about objective measures or productivity in a current or previous job. Maybe it was a sales job, maybe there was commission, maybe there was a quarterly bonus that was paid. You could ask, how was your compensation determined? Was it a discretionary bonus, which is, I would say, pretty much the norm? Or are they coming from a position, or were you in a position where there was no bonus, but there was, maybe other commissions tied to the performance in your role? So it really depends. A sales job is going to look a lot differently than a salaried position with a bonus, right? So most of the positions I see are not sales salary. They're mostly salaried positions, or they could be paid hourly. That would be exempt or non-exempt. It's a little confusing. Some people, especially if you're in the technology field, you may be a 1099 employee. A lot of times there's more advantages to getting compensated that way. So again, just, everyone's salary may look different, is where I'm going with that. So ask applicants for the value of competing job offers they consider. We'll get to this. When you have leverage as a candidate, which most active candidates right now seem to have multiple jobs they're considering or they've won. In that instance, potential employer could ask you, what are some of these other offers and things that you're reviewing currently? That might help them set the market. And especially where things are a little crazy right now in the market through COVID, that's a question you're going to get certainly very, very frequently right now. Receive and use salary history that an applicant offers or volunteers. Like we said, you can volunteer this information if you so choose. And then again, you can ask for salary history after the final job offer has been made. If that person is accepting and you're negotiating, you may already know the number that they're thinking of paying, or they're coming back to you with maybe a counter offer that's more or less what you discuss in your negotiation. At that point, they will be able to talk a little bit about that. So most companies will do a background check, typical CORI check, which could be federal and state. They're looking for things like felonies, bankruptcies, any major, issues that may prohibit their employment, obviously. And then again, they may ask for any sort of salary history relative to other positions you're looking for. So, all right, we touched on this real briefly, but I think before you even hit send of your application, and I think everybody probably does this when they go online or LinkedIn, they look at a job and they try to say, okay, this sounds good, but how much is it going to pay me, right? So maybe you go to Glassdoor, maybe you go to salary.com, bolt.com. Those are resources like that. Maybe you call your friend that works at that company, or maybe someone in a similar field. What can you expect? There's tons of ways to find out really what your salary expectations should be for that position and leveling. The best advice is do a really good job researching this number. You want to know, especially if you are just graduating, maybe you haven't had a full-time role yet, especially here in the Boston area, or if you're looking at areas in a different part of the country, in Florida or California or Texas, there may be different compensation levels based on cost of living. We'll get to this. Inflation's affecting a lot of what these companies are having to offer candidates. So know your market value. Like I said, friends, colleagues, people you trust, networks you've made. they should be able to give you some sort of expectation to consider going into it. And I think, you got to factor in a lot of things too. So, example, position may pay 50 to 60K. What does that mean? Really what that means is they're budgeted for up to 60K. It means that they could pay less depending on experience, depending on what someone might be volunteering, what they're making. Another thing to keep in mind, a lot of internal equity does play a part here. If you're applying to a large company, let's say it's PwC or KPMG, or let's say it's TripAdvisors or HubSpot or any major large institution here in Boston, for example, there's a very strong likelihood there's other people with your level of experience in a similar role or a similar group. And so, just the reality is one person's probably not making 60K and the other person's making 100K to do the same job. They're going to be very similar, and there may be a limit of what they can offer this person because of other people with similar experience or someone who's been there longer that might be making less. The reality is the compensation consultants, HR, any decision maker, they're very cognizant of their team and who's being paid accordingly. So a lot of it might just have to do with the level of the position, how large the organization is, and how big that team is. So when they give you a range of 50 to 60K, that's what they're paying this person for that position. It's likely because the budget is more reflective of the team itself and maybe the current equity that's distributed to the current employees of that team rather. Make sense? I get this, I've had this question before, does my MBA increase my number? Yes and no. Yes, over a longer period of time. I think there's plenty of studies that say, the value of getting your MBA, especially from Bentley, is very advantageous, to you as a professional. I would say, I don't know if employers look at it and say, because you just graduated with your MBA, here's $20,000 more than the person that's also working there in the same level that doesn't have the MBA. Again, back to the internal equity, that's something to keep in mind. But an MBA may allow you to apply to a position because they want an advanced degree that someone who maybe doesn't have the MBA would be able to apply to. So it could open more doors to positions or higher level companies that are really looking for graduate students and not just undergraduate students. So again, if you're thinking, hey, I'm getting my MBA, so they'll pay me 50 more a year, it may not happen that way, but over time, you certainly will statistically earn more than someone who doesn't have it. And then this is kind of a situation that I just want people to be aware of. When you're determining your number, if you're going for a raise, it's a little different than when you take a new job. A company is more willing to pay a premium to get somebody from a competitor than they will be to pay someone who they already know what they're making. You just don't have as much leverage in that situation. I will say on the contrary, though, the past 6 months, even the past year, 2021, obviously 2020 with COVID, it was a very slow year in the markets. 2020 was very, very much not slow. If you were to average the 2 years, it probably was normal, but companies are very aware that there's a lot more money out there people can earn. A lot of people have left the workforce more from a retirement perspective in the professional space. Or if they've been in tourism or hospitality or something like that, that was severely affected by COVID, healthcare maybe. Maybe they've just decided this just isn't the career path for me. So I wouldn't say it's a mass exodus to doing nothing. It's just they're moving around in terms of what their career direction is. But in terms of finance accounting as a whole, I really haven't seen the types of mass exodus that you may hear of in the news. But I will say, there are a lot more opportunities for raises and compensation adjustments because it is such a competitive market right now. So determining your number, knowing that number will help you in that situation effectively. So total compensation. I want to reflect on this a little bit because honestly, it's not just your base salary number that you have to factor in, right? If you have kids like I do and you provide benefits for your family, your health, dental insurance is important. Healthcare costs have obviously continued to rise. Companies are, they'll cover on average, maybe 80, 85% of the cost. Some companies will cover 100%, very few. Some, it might be 70 or 75% if it's a smaller company, but for the most part, companies can cover those expenses. So that's something you got to factor in, is it a salaried position? Is there, what's the discretionary bonus look like? That's not something you want to say, hey, well, I'm going to make 100K and my bonus is 10%. You can't bank on that 10% necessarily, right? It's based on your performance and the company's performance. So something to think about. What other incentives does the job you're applying for or the job you've won offer you? Does it offer you a bonus? Does it offer you a 401k with a match? Does it offer you profit sharing? Will it pay for your commuter pass? I have a client that'll pay the candidate's cell phone bill and a stipend or their IT expenses because they're working more from home now. There's other ways to be compensated that reduce your costs. That's something you got to factor in. Vacation time. A lot of companies have really unlimited PTO now, they'll tell you. Statistically, people take less time with unlimited PTO than if they know they only have 2 weeks of vacation. For whatever reason, that's something to keep in mind. But again, it's a nice perk if you want to take 2 weeks off at a time and the employer will allow you to do that. That maybe is a perk that's important to you in your life. So I guess what I'm trying to say is think about the cost, the location, wear and tear on your vehicle if you have to drive. What sort of cost will I have to pay up front if I am in an accident or there is an emergency? What do I have to have ready to go? Do I have a health savings account that allows me to save pre-tax dollars? So those are things you really need to factor in and look at it from a big picture, not just who's paying me the most base salary is kind of where I'm going with this. Overtime is something also difficult to calculate into it. They've moved over the last couple of years, the non-exempt and exempt number. I think that threshold is now 75K here in Massachusetts. If you're making under 75K, you're an employee at will, and you do have eligibility for overtime. If you're making over 75K, they don't necessarily have to give you overtime. So you may find that you're working, let's use the public accountants, for example. Sometimes during busy season right now, they're probably working 60, 70, maybe more hours a week. They're still making the same amount, albeit they've increased those salaries for those individuals now at associate level and associate level 2 levels. But there is things like overtime is not something that are being factored into those positions. So again, your commute time, your time in an office, what does that mean? What is your value in that? I think those are things you got to think about when you're determining your number and factoring in total compensation. Again, bonuses, I talked a little bit about that, work-life balance, vacation. Work-life balance in particular, it is the first time I did this presentation and today, I can tell you a lot has changed in the marketplace. At the time I was probably going in 5 days a week to the office. Now I probably go in 2 days a week. Sometimes I'm home for the whole week. There's a ton more flexibility out there with employers because we've had to with the pandemic, and what they found are people are being productive. They enjoy the quality of life. I find most candidates want some sort of hybrid back to work. Some want to be in the office full time or be 100% remote, depends on their situation. But I would say 80% of candidates and clients want some sort of hybrid environment. So again, work-life balance might be something to really factor in now. This is probably, you'll find a lot more opportunities that may offer that type of balance than you would have 5 years ago. Again, unless it's maybe busy season, but. All right. I want to talk about raise expectations just a little bit here, because honestly, these numbers do change. And this is new information. This is information from the Conference Board. The Conference Board is a survey where basically they survey compensation executives on really 2 main components: salary increase budgets and salary structure movements. It's a great website. If you want to check it out, conference-board.org. There's a lot of information there. So to give you a little backstory, most companies that are large or publicly held have compensation associates, a compensation manager, and really their job is just determining what salary ranges are for the positions that they have in their organization. They go to conferences, they're on meetings. You can pay to be, I think it's the Radcliffe, it's like a document that's published that kind of gives updates in terms of salary ranges in more of a real-time, month-to-month fashion in terms of what people are paying. Unfortunately, it's a lot of money to access some of those things, so it's not something you could just go on Google and find necessarily. So, but again, compensation people spend their entire time trying to figure out what the market is doing. And even in I probably talked to more compensation people over the last 3 to 5 months because they're like, how are these people asking for these salaries? Why is this what they're making? And the reality is a lot has happened in the last year with COVID, retaining talent, increasing compensations, paying retention bonuses just to stick around in some instances. Certainly in life science, we're seeing that a lot. So there's things that are happening in real time that sometimes these HR people in organizations just are not, they're just not up to speed with, to be honest with you. So they did every April, they do basically a survey. They updated the survey this past November. So as of April 2021, it was looking to be around 3.2, 3.4% in terms of expectations on a raise. So think of that, 3% of 100,000, 3,000 extra bucks, right? But right now they're calculating close to 4% in wage costs and expectations, and it's the highest rate since 2008. And again, I think a lot of it has to do several factors here, right? It's the current inflation, which is 7.5%, probably going to go up a little bit potentially. It also reflects on movement and how much has been budgeted for companies knowing they have to pay their workforce more now. I think there was an article maybe a month or so ago about Goldman Sachs increasing their compensation for first-year associates. There's several law firms that have increased their base salary for first-year associate lawyers coming into their organizations. So the rising tide is lifting a lot of areas. Minimum wage, for example, you see a lot more instances of companies offering $15 an hour more. So all that has really risen a lot of these numbers recently. So, and again, due to high wage growth and inflation since April of last year, this pool has continued to increase. So some of the key findings that I thought were interesting were the 2021 actual total salary increase budgets jumped from 2.6 to 3%. So that means the budgeting itself, how much these companies are budgeting for their workforce to pay this year, has increased 0.4%. That doesn't seem like a lot, but when for years and years and years, it's at the same number, if you're thinking of it from a finance perspective, those little tenths of a point may mean a big deal, especially if your business was hurt by the pandemic. So, and obviously 0.3% for an executive may be different than an entry-level candidate. So really those percentage points are large numbers. The projections for 2022 have jumped almost a full percentage, as I mentioned, 3% to 3.9. Again, they've historically been closer to 2.5%, 3%. And then growth in wages for new hires are accelerating inflation, are the main causes of the jump in salary increased budgets. The survey did show in November that almost half of respondents, 46%, said that the increase of wages of new hires played a factor in salary increase budget estimates. And 39% said increased inflation played a factor. I think what this survey was missing, and it's really happened over the last 3 months, is people are much more willing to leave if they don't agree with the company's back to work situation, right? We've all heard some people with the vaccination, wearing masks, all the discourse and calamity caused by a lot of those mandates have caused people to perhaps change their jobs sooner than they would normally have. Maybe their situation of coming back to work no longer works for them. You also have to factor in, we're coming up on 2 years of the pandemic where a lot of people have still been remote 100% of the time. I can tell you there's a lot of candidates that have taken jobs without setting foot in an office. And when they start to do that, I have a feeling they may say, this isn't the location of the company that I thought I was joining. And so I think there could be more volatility for the rest of the year. And it's already a really tight candidate market. So this will likely continue to increase salary expectations for candidates. It'll have to increase budgets. You hear budget to actual as something that they look at. I think when they do the budgets at the end of 2022, they'll realize they spent more than they thought they did on employment and hiring professionals like myself, consultants, staffing agencies. Those costs I would anticipate going up because it's really difficult to find candidates right now. And a lot of these companies, if they had to make cuts, they made cuts to talent acquisition and HR because they knew maybe they weren't in a position to hire for a long period of time. So they're playing catch up. So if you're applying to companies and you haven't heard back on websites, check in, send another application. It may be that people aren't really paying much attention or as much attention as they did before to the applications that are coming into those companies. So it's really kind of a crazy situation right now. So now let's get back to, now that you kind of maybe know a little bit of the market, that's going to give candidates a little bit more of an understanding of maybe how much they can negotiate. And honestly, more now than ever, like you should be asking if there's room to negotiate absolutely every single time because of the environment and conditions we're in. If you're not asking to negotiate, you could absolutely be leaving something on the table in terms of an offer. When to negotiate. So as we get ready to do the mock negotiation, there's really 2 times in the process that you could look at it as a negotiation. The way I'm factoring a negotiation is not just, hey, let's sit down and talk about what salary it's going to be. Ideally, when I do a negotiation with a client or a candidate, it's actually throughout the entire process. Now, it's probably not something you, the candidate, would do if you're working with the company directly, because you're either going to get it at the beginning. Well, it's going to start at the beginning of the process, right? You're going to have an application. They're going to ask you for your expectations, or you're going to have an initial call or video interview, virtual interview with someone in HR. And they're going to ask you, what's your salary expectations for this position? What's your minimum to consider for this position? That they're going to likely address that unless they already know from the application. So it's going to happen on the initial consult. And then if you're interviewing on your own with a company, that's probably not going to occur again until HR calls you up and says, hey, congratulations, you won the job. What are your salary expectations again? What are you thinking? They'll ask you the same question. My advice would be keep the same number throughout the process, right? Don't tell them you're open to 50K. And then when you get to the end of the interview, tell them you need 75. The client is not going to be happy and they'll likely go in a different direction. So you have to remember what your range and numbers are initially, because those are going to come back and they may already know, but they're going to ask you, hey, what's your range again? That doesn't mean you can't negotiate. It just means you got to stay consistent with those figures. So again, I kind of mentioned this a little bit. It's kind of like buying a car, unfortunately. Like if you volunteer your salary number right up front, say, hey, I'm looking for 50K. Their offer is going to be 50K. If you tell them that's what it is and it's below what their expectations are, they're going to meet what you think because it's perhaps a low number to them. So again, you could always say, you could always politely postpone that conversation. You could say, here's my range, but I would appreciate an opportunity to connect later on in the process if it is determined that a job offer would be procured. So you can always say, I don't feel comfortable, or is there any chance we could maybe have this conversation later on in the process? if you feel uncomfortable. If you feel comfortable sharing your range, then share your range, but just know it's not something you necessarily have to do initially. So you could ask them, well, what are your current salary range expectations for this position? I mean, if I'm giving any advice, like that's a good way to position, and we'll get to mirroring a little bit at the end of the presentation, but like, I think there's a way you can get HR to kind of tell a little bit more about the salary expectations for this position. If you ask, you could say, well, my range was this. You could say, you know, hey, is that salary range acceptable for this role? Is that what your expectations are from my experience? And you may get a response from that. It also may help to know, again, if you're an active candidate, you may say, yeah, so I'm looking at, based on positions I've been actively interviewing on, I know I'm really, my market value target is somewhere in the 60 to 70K range, what I'm just making up numbers. But again, showing that you have market knowledge of what your value is and what other companies are compensating you. The HR person behind the scenes is saying, okay, they're an active candidate. They have a couple of things they're interviewing on, and they definitely know their market value. That's going to alert that HR person to know if that person wins the job, they're really going to have to start, they're going to have to put their best foot forward in this market. So again, that's where I'm saying, when you know your market knowledge and you address these things up front initially in the process, it will pay a dividend at the end stage if you get the job, because they know your market value. They're not going to just give you that 50K offer because you told them your value is 60 to 70 as an example, right? So but honestly, honesty is the best policy. If you're asking for 50 grand more than what you've been making, there's a really good chance that the company knows that your number is way above what their value is. You probably won't advance far in that process. So again, be true to the experience and research that you found. It's okay if you're over it by maybe 5 or 10K, but if you go too far, you risk being nulled from the process, to be honest. So, and it's always beneficial, to leave open-ended questions with open-ended answers. Speak in ranges and be vague at that point in the process. I'm seeking fair and competitive compensation commensurate with my experience for the position. Commensurate just meaning I want basically compensation that mirrors my experience level and the expectations you have for that position. That's effectively what you're saying. And so that might be a great way to present information at that point in time. So at the end of the day, you want to be the final candidate standing. That means that you have an opportunity when you're having this conversation at the end of the process, or they start asking you these questions again towards the end of the process, that you're probably the final person. So, all right. So my friend Ada has volunteered. Ada, are you available and ready to go? We're going to do 3 situations. You ready?
Yes.
Nice. There are 3 situations. I want to go through 3 situations because really, these are the 3 probably situations you're going to find yourself most in. Number 1, as I mentioned initially, and we'll go through kind of what I just went through. Situation 2 is the offer without leverage. And what that means is you don't have any other jobs. You don't have, maybe you're unemployed, or maybe this is your first job out of school. You may not have a ton of information or things that you can leverage in a negotiation. So that conversation is going to be different than in situation 3, when you have leverage. And in that situation, Ada is going to have a couple of jobs that she's interviewed for and maybe has a couple of offers she's considering. So with situation 1, we're going to pretend right now Ada's in, marketing analytics, correct? And so she mentioned Novartis was a company that she saw some positions with. And so I'm going to put her on the spot a little bit, but I'm going to play the role of an HR talent acquisition person for Novartis. And basically I'm connecting with Ada, who had applied directly. And I'm going to be asking her, I'm going to cut right to the chase and ask her about her salary expectations. And we'll see how she does. You ready, Ada?
Yes. And it's business analytics. That's Yes.
I'm sorry about that. So I told you that's not my profession. I'm finance accounting. So, all right, Ada. Well, thank you for applying, and you have a great background. I appreciate you applying to this position here at Novartis. Before we move forward, I definitely want to make sure that this position would make sense for you. But what's your expectation salary wise for this position? What are your expectations for this role?
Okay, so first, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I have made some research on the company for a long time right now. So I'm familiar with Novartis. I'm familiar, especially after the interviews with the project going on. And I'm really excited to be here and to be accepted for this position. Considering my studies, my background, and also the market with how it's going right now, I would like a range for the salary between $45 to $60 per hour. And then, of course, I'm open to discuss and negotiate with you regarding this salary.
Great. So you were making $60 an hour in your last position?
No, not $60 per hour in my last position, because I'm still a student, and I was making $40 per hour. But okay, I don't know what to say here.
No.
Actually, because I was thinking Novartis is actually paying better compared to other companies for this position. So should I connect this with the same industry and skip the question, or answer directly on the question that you said, were you making this amount before? Because maybe no, I was not making, but I'm looking to make that amount of money now, and I'm definitely looking for growth, you know?
It's a great question, and I kind of set that up to because if you notice, now I asked you what your salary history was. Technically, I can't ask that, right? But you answered with some market information for me, and I could view it as that you volunteered that information, even though I did ask you that question. So again, as an example, a lot of times that's how the conversation can go if you feel comfortable doing that. So what I can tell you is, she knew the market value for the position. She had done research on Novartis. That was a really good thing that you understood that. They probably won't ask, so you were making $60K in your last position, but I just use that as an example to show, hey, I'm asking salary history. Maybe I know or don't know that I can ask that question. So how you may want to answer that is, well, instead of saying, well, no, I wasn't making 60 an hour because I'm a student. Well, that makes sense. I can look at the resume perhaps, and I could make that assumption. But what you could say is, well, no, actually, so I, was doing a little bit of market research. I looked at Novartis, and I also looked at some of your competitors and found that for the position of data analyst, whatever the title might be, that that the compensation expectation range is in the 45 to 60 an hour range. So that's actually how I would answer it if you were approached with that situation, right? Is correct them to say, well, right now, the positions I'm entertaining, not just with Novartis, but doing research on industry, I found that I've been targeting 45 to 60K range. Then I think what you could say after then in that situation is that salary expectation accurate with the position that we're speaking of today? Basically saying, is that a range that's appropriate for the position? And they're going to either tell you yes or no. The reason it's good to ask that is because if it's not, maybe it's not the right position, or maybe it's not something that will work for you, knowing that that range is something that you need to inquire in that particular position. So let's go to situation 2 and 3, because I think this is where most candidates, you're going to get a chance to negotiate, right? And I think, again, let's focus on that, because really the HR person may be asking a lot of different questions. Most should not ask you that question, but I wanted to see if I could catch you, and I pleased to say I did. So, all right, situation 2. So, fast forward, Ada has interviewed, and she's been a finalist. She's been told she's a finalist. They've asked likely for references at that point. And so I see a quick question. Should we mention hourly salary or total year salary? It's a great question. I mean, so I know if it's, $60 an hour, it's probably about 120 hours, 120K salary. So it depends if it's, it depends on the field you're in. So in a lot of technical situations, right, like IT roles, it will be hourly for a lot of people that are 1099. So you may speak in hourly, or you could speak in salary numbers. Either way, there'll be some consistency there with it, right? Whether it's just basically take the hour number and times it by 2000, I think it's 2040 hours in a year. So that's where you'll get your salary number. So I don't know if you could say either or, and that HR talent person will probably know, but good question. So
I also think it has to do with the application, because for us as a students, if we apply for internships, since it's just maximum 3 months for one semester, usually the rate in the application or the website is hourly, and it makes sense because it's a short period of time. But usually when it comes to long-term position, a full-time job, then you can talk the annual salary.
So, and that's where I would, again, kind of use your judgment. If it is an internship position and it's asking for hourly, then provide hourly, but know that those numbers do coincide. And so if you're being paid 25 an hour, you're also being paid 50, the equivalent of 50K on a salary, but maybe it's not a salary position. And that's something usually you'll see, if it's an intern position or if it's a high level position, like some of those things you may be able to figure out on your own. The other question is a base salary only and not total compensation. I would recommend just sharing base salary because, again, you don't know what their discretionary bonus may be. Sometimes you don't know the benefits companies may be offering, if they have a 401k match or anything like that. I would do your market research knowing that you're just setting the base salary number. And then when you get to situation 2 and 3, which we'll talk about right now, you're going to be factoring in the total compensation to your decision. And so, if you don't have leverage, we're going to be really looking at what are some other incentives besides base salary if they can't move on the salary number. We have to figure out, maybe it's a 6-month review, maybe it's an extra week of vacation, maybe it's maybe it's a sign-on bonus. Some companies will do that. So it really depends. So, all right. Situation 2, Ada, you've been alerted that they're going to check your references. You shared those references with them. I would say is probably a good chance, and this is on your own, this isn't through a recruiter, but chances are pretty good that an offer is coming. So you get a call randomly from HR on Novartis, and that's where we'll pick it up. So hi, Ada, it's Matt Shannon with Novartis. I just wanted to let you know the references have been completed and I have some good news for you. We'd like to offer you the job. Congratulations.
Hi, Matt. Thank you so much for the call and thank you for the great news. That's exciting.
Great. So I know you're excited about the position. Thank you for your interest. And so with that, we're prepared to offer you your $50 an hour for this position. It is an hourly position, so there is no discretionary bonus, unfortunately. But because but with that, we're going to give you vacation. We'll give you 3 weeks vacation. And for the interim, we'll also pay to allow you to get benefits if you want benefits for that period of time. And then after 6 months, we'll readdress, you could say, right? So what do you think about that offer?
Well, that's amazing, actually. And thank you for sharing all the details with me. I have a question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Is there any flexibility on the base payment rate? The reason that I ask that is because my goal is to be with Novartis for a significant period of time. And I wanted to check if there is some space for an increase on the bonus payment.
Well, I could certainly ask, what would you be looking for in terms of an increase?
For example, I would say $55 per hour.
Okay. Are you considering any other positions at this time?
No, because Novartis is my main goal. I have focused on this company and I'm looking to be here in long term. This was my first choice, top choice. And yeah, I've been focusing in Novartis.
Okay. Well, let me talk to the hiring manager and we'll get back to you and we'll see what we can do.
Oh, thank you
That's
so
it.
much. I look forward to hearing back from you.
Great. See, right there, Ada did an excellent job. Not only did she ask to negotiate professionally, but obviously she knows she doesn't have any leverage right now. But what she was very thorough with is that you're very excited about this opportunity of Novartis. It's the only position you're considering. When you give that type of conviction, I think clients are more willing because they know, well, this is the only thing she's looking for. If we can get her 55 an hour, she's ready to start. And I think a lot of companies, especially in this market, will probably give you the 55 an hour to do it. Now, if you maybe presented yourself differently and I wasn't, and again, we'll go to situation 3, you have other positions that are out there. That HR person is going to have to ask and inquire if you are really interested in the position or not. So the fact you address that, I think, is excellent that you want to do. Again, you want to be appreciative of the offer, and you want to make sure that they know that really it's your top choice. And so you did a really good job with that, Ada. Great. All right, so situation 3, we go through the same situation. Congratulations, you won the job. I presented the offer at 50 an hour. And now, Ada, I want your response to be, okay, is there any room to negotiate? I said, well, what were you thinking? Now I want you to answer with some activity and maybe I'll let you take it from there.
Okay. So do you want me to go ahead and answer in a different
Yeah,
way
so I just
from the question?
I just presented you
You're
the
asking me
offer.
if I have any other position,
Yeah,
right?
are you working with any other companies? Do you have any other offers under consideration at this time?
Yes, I received an offer letter from Moderna this week as well, which is from the same industry, and their offer was $57 per hour. However, I'm still very interested to pursue my career with Novartis, and I wanted to check if is any way that we can negotiate about my salary.
Well, I'd have to talk to the hiring manager and see what we can do. What number would you be looking for? Would you be looking for 57? Would you, if we match the offer, would that be something that you would consider where Novartis is maybe your top choice?
Absolutely. As I said, I'm really interested to work for Novartis. So I would be really happy if we can get that offer.
Okay, all right. And let's quickly play off that. Ada, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to match the 57 per hour. But where Novartis is your top choice, is there anything else that maybe we could do to maybe have you consider our offer instead of Moderna's?
Sure. So if 57 is not an option, can we still negotiate on the initial offer? Is there
Sure.
any space for that?
Sure. What were you thinking? Anything in particular besides the base compensation?
Yes. So if besides base compensation, so there is no space for base compensation, no flexibility.
Unfortunately, 50 is the most we can offer, but I could ask about maybe getting an extra week of vacation, or perhaps after 3 months, if you're with good performance, we could sit down and maybe have a review of your compensation. Do you think that would work?
Yes, that would definitely work. If we can negotiate on that, I would be very happy.
Let me run it by the hiring manager and I can let you know what we can do. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Great. So again, it's hard to predict what situation, and Ada, Thank you so much. That was a great job. And I knew I'd put you on the spot, and you've answered it very well, actually, in my opinion. So again, she kind of left things open-ended with what she would like if they can't move base compensation. So as an HR person, I suggested to her some options where, again, she indicated Novartis was her top choice. You may find that an HR person would be willing to maybe offer up other potential compensate, maybe non-base compensation things that could work for you. So, you know, with that, I would just make sure, if the one thing I would say, Ada, if it wasn't base salary, is there one other thing of a hot button that would interest you? And that's something to think about, right? Maybe it is benefits to you, maybe it's vacation. So just so you know, whatever it is, like if they do ask you and you don't know about base, you know, maybe you would have something prepared to say, well, can we potentially do a review in 6 months? Or would you be open to that? Like at least having a suggestion ready for them.
Right.
Sometimes an HR person may offer something up, but if they're not, they're like, well, if you don't want base, what is it? Like they may just be waiting for you to say something. So always have in the back of your mind something else that you may be able to suggest. So, and I see Brianna, you have a question. This is what I'll tell you. Most offers, at least verbal, are going to come on the phone, at least. Sometimes you will get an email with an offer letter and all that. I mean, in my experience, any sort of conversation with a client or a candidate regarding an offer, I'd really like to get that person on the phone because there's a lot to cover that sometimes isn't always in the email. If you get an email with an offer letter, what I would then suggest to that person is write simply, thank you very much, Mr. and Mrs. HR person. I'm really appreciative of the offer. And let me go to the next slide because I think it might actually touch on this. But when you get an offer, what do you do? So you don't have to accept right away unless it's your dream job and they're paying you a number you are not anticipating and it's above anything you thought you might get. In that situation, if you feel compelled to say yes, then, you know, by all means, feel free to say yes. But most people will take the weekend, they'll take a few nights to think about it. They'll talk to their friends, their family, their professionals. You know, I think you don't have to accept right away. It's appropriate professionally to wait a couple of days or say, hey, if you don't mind, can I take the night to think about it? I'd like to talk to my wife about it or whatever, right? So you do need time to review the total compensation, the benefits, the bonus. So if I think there are some agencies out there, there's some recruiters out there, there's some HR people that may pressure you for a decision. If you're getting that person, in all likelihood, it means that they obviously really like you as a candidate, and it's great to feel wanted in a job. That may not be the right job for you, so it's totally appropriate. Just stay calm and say, listen, I understand, you know, you guys would like a decision as soon as possible. Assuming I can get all the information I need to, I'll do my due diligence as quickly as possible and get you guys a decision as in a time appropriate fashion. So again, just make sure you don't feel pressured by individuals that may be rushing you to make a decision. So, and again, decision makers could be your Bentley advisor, parents, friends, alumni, anyone you feel comfortable, even recruiters. I get a lot of calls like that too. So, so the best way to respond to a lowball offer, Mohammed, great question. Especially, I mean, in the beginning of the process, you're not going to get an offer per se, but like, if they tell you a compensation range that is just too below maybe what your market value is or the research you've been doing, you may say, you know, I do have a question, Matt in HR, you know, you could say, listen, I've kind of been doing my due diligence and research, you know, I've looked at some competitors, you know, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like the compensation range is what I shared. You know, is there anything about this role that maybe I'm not factoring in of why the compensation range may be what it is? Because, you know, I will let you know, I'm really excited and interested about the job, right? So you want to make sure you keep your positivity and interest level high. That's something they're assessing at every point of communication. Is this someone who's responsive to my emails? Are they interested in the job? Are they telling me? the best advice I give people is always be appreciative and excited about an offer. Try to win every job you can. That way you can make the decision. At the end of the day, if the offer is going to be a low ball offer, then you really got to factor in, is this a job that's I want? Is it close to home? Is it going to give me a ton of growth potential? You're not going to make your career salary by just making one job change. It's going to happen over time. And so if it's a step in the right direction for you professionally and personally, that's a decision you're going to have to really factor in and make. So, so that's reviewing an offer. So could you provide an example of how to use current job as leverage in a negotiation if we don't have others? Well, that's a great question. This definitely happens. And this kind of gets to my next point a little bit too, which is, I'll hit next on the slide, how to handle multiple competing offers. And that could be internally, that could be a promotion, right? So again, you're creating leverage by being a valued employee at your current business and potentially taking a new job. HR people are going to be turned off though if you're just trying to just get a new job every single time. So it's going to have to be a situation where, you know, you're very excited about a position, you're serious about the search. So again, honesty is the best policy. As Ada alluded to, yeah, let me be upfront with you. I received an offer letter yesterday from Moderna that's offering me $57 an hour. I like Moderna, but I happen to like Novartis a little bit better. So again, that's being honest with that is really going to help you in that situation. You know, again, if it's your current employer, what I would say, and you have to be careful of, it's just, you know, look, if you're happy in your current job and, you know, why don't you just stay? You know, like that, if you're saying your leverage is your current job, really what you're saying to the employer is that you're maybe not as active of a candidate. You're not serious about, you know, taking a new job potentially, unless you're honest with them that, hey, listen, this just isn't the right role for me. So what most HR people should know is that counter offers are a risk right now, as you'll see in the next slide. Really, 85% of people who take a counter offer do it because they're getting paid more money. It's the same job. And if you were actively looking, you're going to leave, or you may be let go within the next 18 months if the company starts to underperform and they need to reduce headcount. So you really got to be careful about leverage with your current employer, because again, it may speak to your interest in a new job and your effective status as an active candidate. It also, HR people are aware that candidates will go out to try to get a new job, to try to leverage their own company to get them more money. It just may not look, it may look less professional on you leveraging your current employer than saying I'm actively looking at other positions, if that makes sense. Because again, that company knows that they're going to have to pay more. So you could even say, let's say an odd situation. Well, you know, we're going to be paying you $50 an hour. Well, hey, Matt, I really appreciate the offer. I'm really excited about it. I just want to let you know, though, I know we haven't really discussed this yet, but I'm actually making $50 an hour now in my current position. Is there any way there's some room, a little more room in terms of the base compensation? That could be something that you introduce at that time. So I'll try to answer these questions while we go through, but let me just get to the last slide about, again, the counter offer, again, where this is kind of we're talking about here. You want to make sure you want to keep money aside. I know this is a presentation on negotiating salary, but I can't stress enough, like, people take bad jobs all the time because it's paying them more than what the better job is paying them. And it's something you really have to factor in. Is $2 grand, is $5 grand, is $5 an hour going to make that much of a difference, being in a position that after 8 months, 10 months, a year and a half, you're like, get me out of here as soon as possible? You really have to think about that. You have to do your due diligence in the interview process. You know, it's easier to interview because you can do it virtually now, but you're also not getting that personal interaction. Maybe you're not seeing the office, as I mentioned earlier. I think there's a lot of people that maybe took the wrong job because they chose money over maybe the right position or maybe right team for them. And unfortunately, that's why there could be some turmoil in the coming months, years to come based on those situations. So again, most candidates are getting a counteroffer. If you accept a job and you're counteroffered, let that employer know, new employer know as soon as possible. Hey, listen, I want to let you know, I was counteroffered today. They're offering me $60 an hour. Would you be willing to match that? Or you could ask again in that situation. But just know, if you're asking for a counteroffer, for them to go up to 60 instead of 57, they may say, you know what, 57 is our best and final offer. And it's kind of like, you either stay where you want or you come to the new job. And, that's a decision you'll have to decide what's best for you. So, all right. Lastly, I just love this picture. It kind of looks like a buddy of mine. That's why I always use it. But like I said, 85% of the time, a candidate who accepts a counteroffer is either let go or leaves anyways within the next 18 months. Keep that in mind. So to answering your point, maybe leveraging your current job is not the best piece of advice. The best piece of advice would be, hey, I'm an active candidate. I'm exploring other opportunities. If you have another offer, share it. If you're an active candidate and say, well, I'm interviewing on several other positions that are offering this, then that's what you would communicate to that person. So, keep in mind why you decided to look and take a new job in the first place. If it is to make more money, then maybe you've accomplished your goal in a counteroffer. But at the end of the day, you're putting kind of you're putting a perception out there to your employer that you're willing to leave this job if it's not the right fit. You may see limited growth potential moving forward because they know you've already tried to leave before. So something to keep in mind. This is just highlighting the do's and don'ts. Know your number, be prepared for the salary question. Try not to talk salary first, stay professional, keep with a good impression. Every point of contact, whether it's an email or an HR call, is an interview. And if you think of it that way, you'll do fairly well through the process. Consider the whole compensation package, be reasonable and realistic. Don't take offers personally. If it is a low ball, some people get offended by that. They're not offending you. It just might be what they can do. And maybe that's just not the right job if it's not appropriate for what you're looking for. Be timely in your decision-making. Sometimes you may have competing offers that don't come all in at the same time. It's appropriate to ask for more time, but just be mindful of that. The longer you're taking to make a decision, the less the company thinks you're serious about their position. Maybe it just makes sense to move on. Maybe it's not the right fit. You'll always get a hard copy for the most part, but make sure you get one. Obviously, the don'ts are make sure you do negotiate. Do not negotiate. Don't put unrealistic salary numbers. They will check, and a lot of times they might know what their expectations are too. Don't lie about your salary. That is something that could eventually come up. You'd rather be honest with it than have something come in down at the late stage and an offer be taken from you. And then obviously, try to keep your composure, be professional, take your time to make sure that you appropriately review it. Don't burn any bridges at your current employer. And again, don't talk salary first. I think that's a pretty huge thing. So again, any resources moving forward, Google it. Obviously, your advisors at Bentley, Conference Board, Salary, Bolt, Glassdoor. Just remember with Glassdoor, that information is only good as people that put information in, right? And so if someone has an axe to grind or is disappointed with an employer, they're going to go post something. The happy employees are probably not running on there and putting, rave reviews. Some I'm sure are, but you're going to find more negative information sometimes in those sites than positive. LinkedIn, join a salary negotiation group. You could reach out to any contacts in compensation, a comp analyst, maybe it's a friend or someone who's in the space, probably knows a lot more about this, about what expectations could be for that position or in that company. Friends, family, alumni, and obviously a staffing agency like Beacon Hill or any others that you've worked with that you may trust would be a good resource as well. So as we get to questions, I'll kind of go through some of the chats. Let me see here. So I'm going to go back right before Gia's, I think it was. Yeah, obviously Laura's here to help. Let me see. So, okay. So, Cecilia, I think I said that right. Going from public to private accounting, a lot of offers include base salary and then a 10 to 15% bonus, but ultimately that is not guaranteed. How do I negotiate the base salary past this? How do I handle this? If it's fair to ask on half on the, yeah. So again, obviously bonuses are discretionary. You may be able to ask HR, okay, your bonus is 10 to 15%. Let's say they're not willing to negotiate on the base salary. A lot of times the HR person knows, would you say that the 10 to 15% bonus, is that, is it typically consistent in that number? Are there, you may be able to find out what the bonus history is for that position in general, like, expectation wise, they might say, well, yeah, we've actually, to be honest, we've given a bonus pretty much every year for the last 10 years. Like that might give you a little bit of certainty. They might also say, yeah, it's hard to say, it's based on your performance and company performance. You gotta really think big picture with it. Is this a company that maybe has an effect with COVID, or maybe there are geopolitical or, maybe situations in the market that might mean that business, like maybe it's a travel and tourism position. Maybe it's safe to assume the bonus may not be guaranteed, or maybe it's in a, professional services consulting firm and they're pretty consistent with their 10% bonus year in, year out. It's if they're not willing to move on the base, then you may just have to just factor that into the position. In your example, going from public accounting to private, you're already in a good spot, and more likely than not, candidates are making a move every 2 to 4 years if they're not getting financial compensation equal to what they feel their market value is. That's something that's going to evolve over time. The reality is most people aren't going to leave, their first job out of school or maybe public, join a private institution or publicly held institution and be there for 20 years. It just doesn't necessarily happen as much anymore. But with that, if they're not willing to negotiate, it's hard to guarantee any sort of bonus. So maybe there is a sign-on, maybe there is other things. Usually a sign-on occurs though when you're leaving a bonus on a table. You see it a lot in life science or technology. Hey, I have a retention bonus that's paid in May, that's 30,000. Would you be willing to do that? There are different clawbacks, they call them, that companies will do. It could be over a year, it could be over 2 years. And what that means with a sign-on though, is if they pay you a sign-on, but you leave in the first year, you're paying that back. So, you got to be careful what you ask for. If you get into a job that you just don't, that ultimately isn't working out, you don't like your manager, or maybe you separate after 10 months and you negotiated a sign-on, you're paying that money back. And if you already spent it, now you owe that company. So think of it that way. Sometimes you got to be careful what you're negotiating for. So if you're a staff or senior accountant, they're probably not going to give you a sign-on. If you're an executive manager, maybe you're in a very niche career field, or you have a bonus you're leaving on the table, that could be something that you do negotiate. Hey, all right, thank you for the base. No flexibility there. Well, I also want to let you know, to start April 1st, I would be leaving my bonus of $10,000 on the table. Is there any way, was there any other forms to compensate for that? Sometimes that's information you definitely want to disclose. And again, it's kind of counterintuitive to the law. Maybe that's something that employer needs to know, what you're walking away from, so that they can produce the most appropriate offer. If you're going through an agency, that's something I communicate early on. Hey, they're looking for this. And by the way, they have a retention bonus that's paid this. So if they are hired, maybe you would need to consider a sign-on. So it depends in the instance. I hope that answered your question. Tips for negotiating at your annual review. Higher increase, 2% annual of the last 5 years. Yeah, so great question. Here's the situation currently, right? In the market, it's supply demand, very much a candidate friendly market. You've had a lot of people retire earlier than they maybe would have because of the pandemic. You have people changing careers because of their back to work or mask mandate or vaccine mandate. There's a lot of volatility taking place in the market. and every week it seems to be changing. So if you're going to have an annual review, one of the things you might suggest is, hey, listen, my understanding, I know the market's a little tight. I'm getting a ton of messages about new opportunities. I've done some research. I understand the market value for this position is in this range. Again, kind of like going into a new job. Hey, maybe you're getting that 57 an hour. Hey, I'm really looking to be in that 63 to 65 an hour. Is that a possibility? That might be something you ask. So if you're going for a raise, again, that has traditionally been 2% annually year over year, you're most likely, at least over 5+ years, your average salary might be below average now, right? Because an average job change historically is anywhere from 10 to 15%. And now, I've seen 20, 25% increases depending on leveling. Now that's usually higher level jobs, but so an average raise, as you saw, 3.9%, but usually it's 3% in finance. Maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 10% in the best case scenario. But a job change is always going to pay you more than it is staying at a company for a long period of time. And so if they're 2% year over year over year, it's probably an internal equity thing that everyone is getting that rate year in, year out. Now, if your company is not adjusting for inflation currently and giving maybe 4% as the data suggests, maybe that's something you suggest. Hey, I know with inflation costs, CPI, all that stuff is going up, any chance we could look at 4 or 5% raise rather than 2%, given the market conditions? Yes, no, maybe. If they're telling you no, and there's no raises this year, you may want to think about looking outside of your current opportunity. If money is something that you need to, is a major decision factor for you and your family, that, you need a raise or you're looking for more compensation in your role, then you definitely should mention it. I hope that answered your question. Laura's right. Hard copies on the offer letter. Definitely want to make sure the offer letter matches what you've been verbally delivered. Sometimes it's not. Yeah, you're welcome. Discretionary bonuses. It's just tough. You want to factor in total cost, but just know a bonus is not necessarily promised. You might say, well, you said I'd get a 10% bonus and it's 8%. That's just the reality of what it is. I hope whatever that job it is the job you want, though. That's, again, back to the whole thing. Would you take a job because the bonus is 20% and the other one's 10%? What if the 20% bonus can't pay 20%? Don't make a decision based on discretionary information would be maybe some advice there too. So, all right.
Excuse me, Matt. Karit has a question. He has his hand raised.
Okay. I know I'm trying to scroll down. So if you want to take yourself off mute if you want. And
Hi, Matt. Can you hear me?
How are you?
Good, thanks. I want to know, how does the salary negotiations differ for international students when it comes to OPT and CPT and all those factors? If you have the STEM extension or the H-1B, how do the salary negotiations work then? Especially, with all the red tape surrounding that, and how does your experience so I have 10 years work experience, but how would that translate in the US market? And how would you the exchange rate with your salary to the US salary work?
That's a great question, and something Ada and I talked about yesterday. And maybe this is a little bit of good news. I actually placed an H1 candidate in a perm position earlier this year. I can't say I've done that previously. And I think a lot of that has to do with the market conditions for candidates. It's a very candidate driven market right now, and some employers are having a tough time finding people. And so this isn't answering your question, but what I'm saying is I'm hopeful that because of those market conditions, the international students are going to get much more of a look, right, than maybe they did in previous years. I think the other trouble sometimes with negotiating, as we use the hourly example, if it's an internship, if it's something that after 3 months it may close, you have to factor in, if there are other people interviewing in that position and maybe they share that, they might say, listen, we're going to pay you $24 an hour for this position. You know, you're our top choice, but just want to let you know there are other candidates interested in this position that, you know, financially are looking at that same range. So you gotta factor in, you may not be the only international student in on some of these positions, because let's face it, not every position is going to be open to international candidates. So I think on the flip side, you could argue perhaps that positions that do offer to, I guess what I was saying before was that a company that maybe wouldn't normally have hired an H-1 candidate decided to hire an H-1 candidate. But if you're applying to positions that, you know, maybe a lot of international students are also applying to, those market conditions might be a little bit different. You may not have the same leverage as other candidates would have potentially. You got to think of it too. Is that opportunity going to commit to you long term? You know, sometimes just getting that is enough to say, yeah, I want it. But at the end of the day, I think the rules shouldn't be different. You should still ask. I would just set your expectations that they may be less willing to negotiate, because maybe it's just an hourly position for 3 months or 6 months. And that's just what the position's budgeted for. And there may be not much flexibility. The flexibility, if you're through an agency, is on the agency side, because they're the ones paying you. It's not the client, right? So the agency typically will have sometimes an 80 to 100% markup on you as a candidate. I could get into that later if you wanted to, but basically the agency might be able to give you a few more dollars, and it's not the company. So you really need to know who the audience is. If you're going through an agency or a staffing firm, you want to negotiate with your recruiter, not the HR person at that company, right? They're paying a flat rate fee for that position one way or the other. Your salary is actually relative and determined by your recruiter. So you would want to negotiate with your recruiter in that instance. I don't know if that's answering your question, but I know a lot of, certainly on IT side, a lot of H-1 candidates, a lot of visa candidates may be going through an agency in that instance. So in that case, you should absolutely, you might be able to get a couple more dollars an hour through your agency. And that would reduce their revenue, but that it is in their budget, so to say. I don't know if that answers your question, Karat, but it's probably still going to be a little challenging. Not everyone's going to be able to go through and hire international students, at least directly, like permanently.
And one thing, excuse me, I just wanted to add, the good news too is during the application process, you should be answering the questions. If now or in the future you require sponsorship, you would, for anybody who's an international student with OPT, you should be answering yes to those questions. So they would know from the onset that you would require sponsorship in the future. And I think a follow-up question, this has come up before, and I don't know if you have some context on this. Do you ever see in the offer letter including that they would consider sponsorship in the future, that being negotiated into the offer letter in the case that many of our students have 3 years of optional practical training, so the sponsorship of H-1B wouldn't be for a few years? So have you ever seen that in writing?
Yeah, so actually with that deal I did earlier this year, it was something that we asked to put in the offer letter. So I think what you should understand about offer letters, it's like any legal document. It's the same document every time, and HR just goes in and changes a couple of things. So unless you're, I don't know, unless they have a template specific to international students, it would be something I would absolutely want to get on paper though, right? In a hard copy, is ask, hey, listen, we discussed verbally, you guys are willing to commit, you know, in 3 years to the visa process. I just want to make sure that's included in the offer letter. Or maybe it's another document. And actually in this instance, I think they produced another document speaking to the timeline of how they would address each, how they would address the visa situation at the end of the day, right? So to your point, Laura, and you probably know more about this than I do, but I would make sure if it's not included to ask that it's included. They just may not realize, like I've even had offer letters where the title is different. And the reason is HR forgot to update the title because it was it's the same template document they use every single time. So you just want to make sure you're asking them about that, because it may not be in their template, if that makes sense. I have this question from Pedro about negotiating unvested RSUs. So I've dealt a lot with this, certainly in pharmaceuticals. Now, it depends on what they are. If they're RSUs or are they options, like it depends on the type of, I mean, you're asking in RSUs, but like if you're just talking of equity in general, usually the company you're probably going to is also, if you're asking about if they'll compensate for it, a lot of times it might be a publicly traded company and they're giving you unvested RSUs as well, depending on the leveling and the type of company. If they're not giving you any stock or equity or RSUs, that could be something you can inquire and ask. I think companies are less inclined to match uninvested RSUs because really you're leaving for a new job, right? But to the example I used earlier about a sign-on, so a candidate might say, hey, listen, and again, a lot of these, just so you know, these RSUs, and you probably know, but they vest at different times, right? Usually 25% after the first year, and then the remainder could vest monthly or quarterly over a 4 or 5 year period from there. So like it depends on if you're walking away from something that's going to vest momentarily, like, hey, next month I have $10,000 worth of shares that are about to vest. You could look at that as a bonus that you're walking away from, and that might be a sign-on that they compensate for. They may not. Again, it's those shares will vest and go to you if you're employed there. If you don't want to work there anymore, it's why would a company give you something to compensate that? If they offer you their own shares or with their offer, it's something you see clients negotiate with less, I would say, than let's say you're leaving a bonus on the table, or maybe you can get more money on the salary. I don't know if that answers your question, but it is a good question. It definitely happens. What other questions?
Matt, we're running up on time and you've done such a beautiful job. We respect your time so much. Is there anything you wanted to conclude with, including when the audience should reach out to you in the future?
Yeah. So email's definitely, email's best. If you guys have questions on your own, you have, your own situation, that you've encountered recently or that you're involved with and you want some counsel and advice, it is free. So if you have any questions or things like that, my email's up there, or Laura has my contact information. Laura, you're welcome to share with anyone and everyone in the class that may have additional questions. I guess the moral of the story is just make sure you guys do negotiate, but you got to win the job. And if there's anything I can do to help you in those situations, because they're all going to look a little different, I'm more than happy to help. So feel free to reach out, connect with me on LinkedIn, and it's been a pleasure to see you guys again. Hopefully we'll see you guys soon. And thanks, Ada, for all the help. You've been great.
Thank you so much, Matt. We appreciate your time, and we too in GCD are available to answer questions as you get offer letters. We can't wait to participate in that fun part of the process. So good luck to everybody, and please stay in touch as we have many great upcoming events through our office over the next 6 weeks, including our grad school career fair that's coming up March 9th. So please do check that out and get registered so that you can inch your way to getting that job or internship offer. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us.